Good to go. Are we live? Broadcasting? Okay. Good afternoon, folks. I will now call the meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and the chair of this committee. This afternoon, Naka Power Utilities will provide a presentation on the state of energy in the Northwest Territories. Today's meeting is being held publicly and live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we begin, I would just like to remind all members, particularly the witnesses, to direct all comments and questions to me as chair. The microphones automatically operate from our sound booth there, so please wait to be recognized before speaking. It just helps us have a well-organized meeting and helps the sound staff turn on the right microphone. This helps keep our meeting organized and running smoothly. I will now ask members to introduce themselves. Starting with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Nuvik Beaulieu, and welcome. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Kate Reed. I'm the MLA for Great Slave here in Yellowknife. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, and I believe we have a member joining us online as well. If you want to introduce yourself. Is he not there? Okay, not online yet, but I do believe Mr. Hawkins is planning to call in. So Robert Hawkins is the MLA for Yellowknife Center. And I will now invite the chair of Naka Power Utilities, NWT in Yellowknife to please introduce yourself and your team and then proceed with your presentation. Over to you, Mr. Beaulieu.
I'm assuming the mics are automatic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julian. My name is Darrell Beaulieu. I'm the CEO for Naka Investments and chair of Naka Power Utilities. And Jay?
Thank you. I'll introduce the rest of the team. So Jay Massie, and I'm responsible for the utility here, Naka Power Utilities here, as well as ATCO Electric Yukon, as well as a small team in Alberta that I work with. To my left is Vic Barr. He's the manager and responsible for local operations here for Naka Power in Yellowknife. And on the far right, Chris Cullingham is responsible for our government relations, rate design, and yeah, that's our team. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And just before we begin, I'd like to go to Ms. Whalen Armstrong to introduce herself.
Okay. Jane Wayellen Armstrong, MLA for Mofi, Klitschou Region.
Okay, and with that, we can move forward with the presentation. Who wants to start or lead the presentation? Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in starting, I guess, just review the purpose here, and I'm not sure is the clicker on? Whoops. Okay, I think I went too far. There we go. So just to go over the the purpose, I think as mentioned, we're here to share our perspective on the state of energy here in the Northwest Territories. And we see ourselves as a key player in helping the NWT achieve its ambitious goals, and also to propose solutions to help foster a collaborative environment focused on economic development, on Indigenous ownership, and the future energy of the NWT. We've been operating here in the Northwest Territories for about 70 years, and we're an award-winning partnership for almost 40 years, and one of Canada's first Indigenous-owned utilities, electric utilities. And again, one of the largest private sector investors in NWT electrical infrastructure. And we looking at forecasting at about $34 million over the next several years. We have currently 28 employees, and we serve about 11,700 customers, and we're regulated by the Northwest Territories Public Utilities Board. And we generate and we transmit and we distribute electricity, and our mandate is for safe, reliable, and affordable service. And again, you know, in staying with the purpose, we're looking at, you know, the NWT rate system. We're looking at equality for all of our customers. We're looking at efficiencies and moving into what the ownership means, I guess, for our communities. As we're all aware, Indigenous people make up over 50% of the NWT population. And of course, we all want to continue to participate in growing the NWT energy economy and creating economic opportunities for our communities. And very recently, you'll see the picture of the photo here, the Electricity Canada's 2024 Leadership in Communities Partners Award that we recently received. And we're proud to invest and reinvest capital into the power system to benefit the NWT and our communities. And we're proud, you know, of the achievements we've made with Naka in delivering that service here in the NWT for the past 70 and 40 years, respectively. So benefits of Naka, I guess, is that besides investing, our local employees that remain accountable to us residents of the Northwest Territories in terms of electricity provision and the contribution that they make to the local economy. Naka has access to economies of scale, supply chains and materials, which Jay will get into a little later. That includes support from affiliate utilities that have unique solutions and emergency response as we experienced during the floods and the fires in the last couple of years. And very importantly, access to capital, which can reduce the pressure on the GNWT debt cap and free up government resources for other priorities. And we bring new investment and we reinvest in the NWT. And of course, through the, as approved by the Public Utilities Board, our costs are transparent and are scrutinized and approved. And most important to us is that we're Indigenous owned here throughout the NWT through the 27 First Nations. So I'll just stop there and I'll let Jay continue on in the more technical aspects of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Chair, I guess I have two chairs in the room today. That's interesting. So I just want to give a quick overview just of the energy landscape in the NWT. And won't surprise anybody in the room, of course, the immense geography that you have in the NWT. Relatively low population that is quite a bit spread out. There's two large hydro grids and then 26, 27 isolated grids. So all those isolated grids work off diesel generation. The hydro grids as of late have suffered from low water and drought, and that is replaced by diesel to keep the lights on. Terribly expensive for both the utility customers and the environment, of course. Policy and financial support right now is disproportionately directed to benefit NTPC customers. Get into that a little bit more a little bit later, but that financial support really needs to be equal for both NTPC and Naka customers. Of course, the debt ceiling is under pressure, which the members know better than I for sure, and with that, the NTPC being a big part of that debt, being the Crown Corp. And of course, utilities costs to operate in this environment are increasing. With the low population and the industry growth, while that results in revenue that is flat and or decreasing as costs continue to increase. Do I have the next slide? A little bit about the energy landscape here in Yellowknife. So on that top part, those are the specific functions of a utility, from both generation, where they make the power, and that could be hydro or thermal. Of course, there's transmission, distribution, and then general operating costs will include customer billing and the cost to deliver that service to customers. In Yellowknife, you'll see that is the green part is Naka's costs, and the rest of the costs on there are for Yellowknife are NTPC. Below, you'll see what that results in a typical bill, and these percentages are based on recent applications that are before the utility board. They're not approved yet, so there'll be puts and takes and may adjust slightly, but these are overall what percentages Yellowknife customers can expect. For NTPC charges in that 78% range of a typical Yellowknife bill is NTPC's cost to generate and transmit, and the remaining of that bill is Naka's. Next slide. Here we just really wanted to give an overview of the energy sector and the timeline. So part of being here today, giving that overview of the energy sector, but not just from our point of view, but in the past. So in 2001, that Robertson report, I won't read everything on this slide for sure, but that Robertson report really highlighted that franchises, Naka's in particular, could be grandfathered for a 20-year period. It also highlighted the fact that in the NWT really should look at a two-zone rate system. So this was a report that was commissioned by the NWT back then in 2001. You move up to 2010 where the Creating a Brighter Future document was produced. So in 2001 there was community-based rates, so each community had their own rates and cost of service to supply those communities. For isolated communities, of course, that is very, very expensive. So the report was talking about a bit more of a communal rate system, two-zone system. In 2010, it moved in that direction. That resulted in the current seven-zone rate system. Again, the recommendation out of that report was about grandfathering or keeping the existing franchises for Naka, which really was about efficiency and keeping the current franchises in place was cost effective. And that, again, it reiterated that the NWT would benefit from a territory-wide rate system. 2015, we move forward to 2015 in the Hay River franchise. Of course, Hay River, the town of Hay River announces the RFP. At that time, really, we noted there was a lack of economic rationale to do so. However, move forward, and really, we're still at that point where we're not seeing the economic rationale for it, and the point of necessarily removing indigenous business from the community. In 2023, with the wildfires, it was a busy year for everybody in the territory, not just the utilities, for sure. We had our regulatory applications that went in that really to affect the disposition of the Hay River or the transfer of the Hay River franchise from Naka to NTPC. That that started in 2023. It is still ongoing, and we have rate applications that are before the PUB currently on it. This all brings us to today as we look forward, not only today, but we look forward into the energy transition and the grid modernization that's going to be needed to affect this transition with net zero commitments. What that's going to require is a significant amount of investment in the power system. That, coupled with extended droughts, is really, and all the costs that the utilities are incurring, is really going to, again, be a major cost driver for the territory going forward. And, of course, today in the utility industry and across Canada, Indigenous participation in the energy economy is a focus. Next slide, please. Cost recovery, just utility rates really is a recognized principle for utility rates that they need to recover the cost to provide service. Like any business and or operation, if you're not recovering your cost to provide service, it is not sustainable. Based on the current applications before the board, the proposed Tallston retail rates from NTPC recover approximately 76% of those costs. So that's for the whole Tallston zone. This is approximately $5.7 million shortfall. So there's the recovery and rates for the zone are falling short of the costs to serve that zone for NTPC by $5.7 million. Our rates to date have been typically designed to recover 100% of the costs. Again, common principle that really needs to be in place to be sustainable or have sustainable rates. Next slide. Thank you. A little bit of a breakdown of that on this slide is 75.6% of costs to serve. So in the utility industry, it's called the revenue to cost ratio. And you'll see it on the right side on that graph. These are the rates that really were promised back in 2016 to Hay River. Really the point that these rates and the recovery of the costs are not covering the cost to serve across the Tallston zone for NTPC. In the current application, we'll also see that the revenue to cost for Yellowknife, so from that earlier slide, the cost for NTPC for Yellowknife, which is called a wholesale rate, is 108.4%. So that results in more revenue than your costs by $3.7 million. So our concern is that with the shortfall in the Tallston zone, that our customers in Yellowknife are covering those costs by that 108%. This expansion and the expansion of the Tallston zone rates to Hay River is just increasing that shortfall that's existed for quite some time. Next slide, please. This shows a bit of a breakdown of the typical residential bill comparison. 600 kilowatt hours, that's a common amount of energy that has been before the board for quite a bit of time. Anyway, on the left-hand side of the picture there, that's Yellowknife customers, our customers. And you'll see that the total cost to serve is $234 per month, and the total bill is $249. So that $15 differential between the cost to serve and then how much customers pay for that service. Like any business or operation, really should recover costs that exceed what it costs to serve. And really that is just so we can keep investing in the system, or a business can keep investing going forward. On the right-hand side for Tolston Zone, you'll see it's quite the opposite. So the total cost for both government and non-government, which is the residential, government's $294 is really what the total cost is, and then the bill is $232, so it's $62 less than it costs to serve them. The residential is $304, and the total bill to the residents are $216, so a lot less than the cost to serve. And this is not unique, I would say, to the NWT in the north. Really, the bigger centers across the north and do support the communities, and that we see that across the north on not just in utility operations, but all sorts of operations. Our point is really that we want that to be the same for all customers, regardless of which utility serves them. Next slide, please. So that's a bit of the landscape, and then the cost pressures that we are seeing now and that will be seen going forward. So utility sector, it's under significant cost pressures, ongoing replacement and upgrading of electrical infrastructure. There's large hydros and all those isolated power plants, power lines. Everything needs to be maintained, of course. Additionally, there's an energy transition underway, and this is across Canada. And this is just really the focus of reducing greenhouse gases and shifting more energy from fossil fuels to electricity. And to do this, and it's happening across Canada, and NWT is no different, it will require also significant investments in the electricity system. In the NWT, with the low population and industry growth, the revenue is quite low and or flat. So you have the problem of utility operations and service. Those costs are increasing with revenue that is relatively flat across the NWT. And then we tack on with the Hay River franchise, just the transition being unnecessary. That's resulted in unproductive expenses for both utilities. The promised electrical rates that are in place and that are recently filed for before the utility board do not recover the costs to operate in that jurisdiction and shift some of those costs into Yellowknife. Those are the operational costs, and then we factor in the estimated cost to actually purchase Hay River electrical franchise. It's about $26 million as of the January 1st that's coming up. So with those pressures, we have some of the solutions that we are looking at, and first is the simplification of the rate zones. So you go back to the 2001 report that talked about 2 rate zones, the 2010 report that said really should get to 2 rate zones. It was simplified down to 7. Really think this is a very opportune time to look at going to that 2 rate zone, or postage stamp rates, changing the rate zones for the NWT at this time from the 7 zones that it is. Just with the existing zone structure and how it's set up, it provides for unequal rates for customers, for similar customers. It's fairly expensive to administer and quite complicated. So the simplification of it, to have the similar rates throughout the territory, typically referred to as postage stamp rates. Those rates, the Yukon has been there for some time, I think right since the devolution of NCPC in the mid-'80s. It happened in both territories at the same time, where electrical infrastructure transferred from the federal government to the territorial governments. The Yukon went to these rates at that time, and I would note also Nunavut just went through a similar rate restructuring last year or the year before, where they had a large number of different rates for different communities, very similar to the NWT, where they have 25 isolated communities, and they simplified down. I don't believe it's just to two rates, but they really simplified their rate zones down, which assisted in one, efficiency, and two, just less cost overall for all customers. Next slide, please. So again, if you simplify the rate zones, territory-wide rates, that quote on there is from the Robertson report, again back in 2001. It really is about ensuring all customers have fair and equitable rates, regardless of the utility provider. There are current incentives in place through GNWT with the TPSP and also the GREP that really are about supporting customers and electrical rates. Those can be factored in and also designed in this rate structure, really to the benefit of all the NWT. What this does is really allows the benefits of these legacy hydro projects or hydro generation facilities to be shared by all citizens. It'll reduce the administration and regulatory complexity and really overall reduce costs to the NWT. Next slide, please. So, in addition to looking at zones, rate zones and restructuring of rates within, there is the concept of streamlining utility functions. So similar to that beginning slide where you'll see all the different utility functions that there are, from generation, both hydro and thermal, to transmission, which is the higher voltage lines that move greater amounts of electricity around, distribution, which are the lines up and down the streets, and customer service. So those utility functions, currently there's a fair amount of overlap, as you see on the left side of this slide. There's a fair amount of overlap between Naka and NTPC. If we simplify or streamline the utility functions where we have defined roles with no overlap between NTPC and Naka, NTPC focuses on generation, both hydro and thermal, and Naka, where transmission and distribution is basically the wires. It really is in the customer service, serving the customers. It really removes the duplication and gives some clear areas of responsibility. There's economy of scales to be found in there. It provides for more efficient operations, which again leads to lower costs overall for NWT citizens. The next slide. I will pass it back to Mr. Beaulieu.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay. Again, maybe helping close the presentation here, and want to kind of focus on creating certainty around Naka's franchises. And just a little bit of background, I guess, in that and to date that, it respects our long-standing Indigenous investment here in the NWT and electricity sector. Looking at reducing significant costs associated with pursuing and defending franchises. It just makes sense to collaborate. And looking at increasing the stability for long-term planning. And really it's consistent with previous NWT reports and policies. And again, the intent is reducing the distractions, promoting focus on existing utility issues that are beneficial to the ratepayers. And always looking at the efficiencies of reducing energy costs in the NWT. And as Jay mentioned, it's quite consistent with other jurisdictions. In closing, I guess, I think it's important that we mention that embracing Naka is a valuable partner in the NWT and creates certainty not only around Naka's franchises, but for the electricity system itself. In terms of moving forward, I think it's important to pause the rate design component of regulatory proceedings so that we can work together on a territory-wide rate design, as Jay just gave you a little bit of detail on. And very crucial, I think, to explore potential efficiency improvements and to streamline some of those functions between NTPC and Naka. So I think the message is let's work together and let's tackle the challenges that we're all facing. And these are huge challenges. With that, Massie.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to committee for questions. I have Mr. Hawkins online first, who I introduced earlier and has joined us online. Mr. Hawkins, over to you. And members, if you just want to indicate to me, I'll put you in line. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it. I appreciate the presentation. I have a completely different view, but that said, that doesn't change the fact that I still maintain the highest respect for Mr. Beaulieu, and I believe he knows that, but I just wanted to reaffirm that's never changed. Mr. Chairman, I think my first question is how much did Naka make in the Northwest Territories last year for profits? Or give me the most current year that's been reconciled. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I'll turn that over to Mr. Massie.
Thank you. I do not have that number in front of us. That is publicly available information on the utility board's website. What I would say is the return on equity is a return on investment. So that is both Mr. Beaulieu and his team's investment in the territory getting a return, as well as ATCO's return on investment. And I would say that really the point of a return for a utility is that you're able to recycle that finance or financial capital and reinvest in the system. That a utility is designed to have a return on their investments. All utilities, not just Naka. And what a utility does is bring that capital back in and recycle it. And as I pointed out, there's quite a bit of investment that is required in the NWT now and going forward. And really that would be what that return would be designed for.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, follow up?
Yeah, thank you. It says ATCO Limited adjusted earnings for this, last year was $432 million for 2023. I don't have the time to go through to tease out the difference of how much ATCO Power made. So it's very difficult. I'm a little confused by a few of the statements made, Mr. Chairman. And just in brief, I'll just say, the unnecessary transition that's referring to Hay River, it's public franchise competitive process. I thought Naka is a private business, which I acknowledge and I welcome investor participation. Unproductive for both sides. I believe Naka, through Northland Utilities, was taking the town to court, so one would argue that. Pursuing and defending a franchise is another way, saying we want a sole source. So the distractions are all built around, and I wish Naka would just say, and I'm going to be frank, Mr. Chairman, and this doesn't change my great respect for Mr. Beaulieu. Why doesn't Naka just take the veil off and frankly say, we want a sole source, we can deliver power cheaper, and we're asking NWT Power Corp to stay in their lane, and we'll stay in our lane, and hopefully work separately. Because NWT Power Corp does deliver services. I'm not going to say better or worse, but for better or for worse in communities, the same way as they do in these larger centers. So if they're really asking for a sole source, Mr. Chairman, why don't they just frankly say it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Once Mr. Massie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say that we are not looking for a sole source. Our franchise is up for renewal with the city of Yellowknife as of next year. We're having good conversations. We understand that we have to compete. I would say, and this is probably better coming from Mr. Beaulieu, but for an Indigenous business to compete with government is difficult. Especially when you look at 76% of costs, only 76% of costs are being recovered. Not too many businesses can operate like that. Government can, and as a multi-generational northerner, I understand how government works in the north, and that can be a way of going forward. But yeah, Naka is happy. We're more than happy to compete as long as it's a level playing field.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Reed next. We typically just do 2 questions per member per round of questions. So, Ms. Reed, up to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. So just so I can understand what you're saying a little bit better, you spoke about how in the rate design you're basically asking the GNWT and legislators here in the Assembly to increase costs on small communities, and as you alluded to in your previous answer, that's a little bit politically unpalatable, I'd say, for this building, is a nice way of putting it. But how do you envision the rate design lowering costs overall? You spoke to investment in infrastructure. Is it mostly through that, or could you expand on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Massie.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So overall rate design, it's a fairly complicated exercise for sure. I think really part of us being here today and talking about it is that we cannot do it by ourselves. The utilities and even the PUB cannot look at rate design without policy direction from government. So what I would foresee is that those parties are in the room really to work it out. And again, back to having equal or similar rates for similar customers. Back to that level playing field. That's really what the ask is. And again, I understand how in the territory, the big centers subsidize the smaller centers. We just want to ensure that, again, that it's the same for all customers.
Thank you. Ms. Reed, do you have a follow-up?
Just a little more, and maybe later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next on the list, I have Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I understand when you said it's difficult to compete, especially Indigenous, and I really do appreciate, that this is an Indigenous owned. So my first question is that, so how many communities, is it just only Yellowknife that you're providing services to, or is there any other community outside of Yellowknife you're providing services to?
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu.
Yeah, we provide services currently to the city of Yellowknife, the Taunahee River, Katlodichi First Nation, Enterprise, Kakisa, Fort Providence, and Wikwiti. And also Riverwoods, just outside of the river.
Thank you. Ms. Whalen Armstrong for follow-up.
Naka, that's what my dialect said, Naka in Klitschko. So it says here too that you have, that's a good information to know that, you're providing all those services. It's, I know that I talked to some of the chiefs when they were in Bichiko last 2 weeks ago. So, especially from the Decho region. So, you said there's 28 employees in NWT. So how many of those are indigenous, since this is an indigenous-owned company? Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like Mr. Massie wants to take this one on first.
I won't have a great answer for you. The majority of the employees are local, are NWT, multi-generational, or people that have been in the NWT for quite some time. The problem with that question, we do not ask to self-identify. So it would be up to them to let us know.
Okay, thank you. I'll get you on the list for follow-up, Jane. Mr. Rogers, I have you next for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I mean, it's no secret, I've said in the House and I've said in this building that, governments, not only our government, but all governments aren't spectacular at running businesses, and that we should look at opportunities to look at partnerships, particularly with Indigenous governments, and then who they choose to partner up with in industry as well. So the question I have, I guess, if the presentation suggests that GNWT keeps the generation and that the transmission and the distribution then goes to Naka in this case, have you, if you're looking at doing that territorial wide, I think that's what the presentation kind of says here, have you reached out to other Indigenous governments? And I know that's a very complex thing to do, but certainly in other regions, to kind of look at extending that partnership beyond just Tetancho and Mr. Beaulieu's group, but to other Indigenous groups through the territory as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like Mr. Beaulieu wants to take on that question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Really good question. I must say that has been a point of discussion at the NWT Indigenous Leaders Forums that we've had over a number of years, their interest in the ownership and of electrical services to the regions and to the communities. At this point in time, besides Naka's franchises, and I forgot to mention Fort Providence was another franchise we've held and will continue to hold. The NWT Power Corporation has all the other franchises in every other community of the Northwest Territories. And I think it's important that each of those communities and to the regions that they're in, there are some discussions. I'm aware of some MOUs that the NTPC is in discussions with some communities and regions, and some of the assets that they've built, such as Inuvik Wind and the Snare Rapids infrastructure that was put in the 1990s. That's leased back to NTPC, I should say. So the momentum, and as I mentioned earlier, in terms of what's happening across Canada, is that more and more Indigenous nations are becoming owners of generation, transmission, and distribution assets right across the country. And as we're all aware, a majority of that happens on Indigenous lands, and with comprehensive land claims and treaties being finalized, I think more and more of that is definitely in our near future here. So it's definitely a conversation that's happening.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and obviously, I mean, if you look at what's happening in my region over Delta with what the NWT are doing with gas up there and with energy in general, so that's why I bring that up. You talked about what you've compared it to what other jurisdictions have done. Can you kind of elaborate on which jurisdictions you were referencing and how that works in other jurisdictions where Indigenous governments and their industry partners are providing the service?
Thank you. I'll go back to, I think, Mr. Beaulieu again.
Yeah, no, if you look at starting in BC with Naka thermal in Fort Nelson, that's a multi-billion-dollar project that the Fort Nelson First Nation is working with the BC government, and in Alberta there are a number of solar farms being built with Indigenous partnerships. Saskatchewan just released very recently one of the largest solar farms south of Regina with about 9 First Nations. Manitoba, and the biggest ones are probably in Ontario, Wate Power. That is 100% owned 1,800 kilometer transmission line, and that's working with a number of First Nations in Northern Ontario. Another one that's just currently being negotiated is in the south side of Ontario, and that is about another 200 kilometer transmission line with the First Nations of that region. I know that the Crees, the Grand Council of the Crees and their development corporations are working on providing power not only to their communities, but to resource development projects in the northern part of their territory. So it's beneficial to them in the long term, economically and socially. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Before we go to round two, I'll just do a couple questions of my own. The first one I have is the pricing you were referring to that's been applied for by NTPC in the current rate application. The pricing which isn't recovering costs in one region and putting that onto another. I found it curious that this doesn't somehow break any of the rules which govern the Public Utility Board's decisions. I'm not sure if you're the person to ask this question. Maybe this is better positioned to the board themselves or to the minister, but I'm curious kind of how that works and how it's possible that whichever entity, whether it be Naka or NTPC, is able to do that. Mr. Massie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would say what we put forward there is what's been applied for. So a utility applies for rates or treatment of rates. Really, the whole business of a utility goes before a utility board, including those concepts, and they have to be approved. So first thing I'd say is they're not approved yet, but that shortfall that's existed in the Tallston zone has been there for quite some time. And I guess I can't speak for the utility board, of course, but if a utility chooses not to recover costs and rates, that is up to that specific utility, I guess. Again, it goes back to what that utility or whichever utility applies for is really up to them. And there is a band typically in place for that revenue to cost ratio for utilities. I could speak in the Yukon, for example. Government rates are usually about 130% of the revenue to cost. So government is charged more than the cost to serve them. So residential and customers and citizens can have lower rates than that. So that is, again, a fairly typical approach in the north.
Thank you. The other question I had is just, this idea of streamlining utility functions. So my understand of that is, it seems to me like what you're suggesting is that Naka's kind of scope be expanded to providing distribution in any of the communities that NTPC currently serves. So I guess my question to you is, just knowing that the franchise decisions are with the communities, I mean, is that even a possibility to be done? And is it the Legislative Assembly that idea needs to be brought to? Is it the communities? Can you kind of explain how you're anticipating such a change would work that you're proposing?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So really looking at that proposal is how a lot of jurisdictions are set up, where utilities have defined functions. There are generators, there's transmitters, and there's distributors. So that really was the genesis of that proposal, is to mirror a typical utility or electrical sector. For us, how we would see that, if similar to what's in that Robertson report in 2001, that franchises are grandfathered or the franchises are streamlined through policy, because there are quite a few of the communities that do not have franchise agreements. So it's not the same everywhere across the NWT. There's some communities that have franchise agreements with the utility provider and some that do not. So I would think that would have to be done through policy, just to ensure that franchise agreements are either the same across, or they don't exist across the territory. That's just my opinion. I would assume there'd be a bigger conversation on that. And really, again, back to those separate functions for utilities, really once you get into those specific functions, really utility can focus on their function, whether that's customer billing or being the wires company or being the generator. Really focuses a company on that, which again leads to efficiencies in our mind.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for committee's indulgence letting me ask some questions there. For round two, I have Mr. Hawkins up again.
Thank you. I'm just going to qualify my next remarks by saying this, and although it won't provide much relief for the presenters, but I'm hoping it's a principal issue which they won't go unnoticed. Which is, I believe in private market, I believe in private business, and I believe ATCO is not only an amazing company, it's an upstanding company. But the issue here I have is the cost to Northerners and the best way to get the best cost. And if you folks can distinguish the difference between then you finally know what I'm talking about and why I feel so strongly about it. Because at the end of the day, if families can't afford power, as you know, life becomes unpalatable. So that's part of my issue, or I should say that's the germination or the source of my issue, is ensuring that we have the cheapest power for people at any opportunity. And so it's not against ATCO or NADCA or Northland Utilities or any other acronym you want to throw in there. It's that primary issue. So I welcome you not to take this personal. But it's personal to me that power is unaffordable for families. So back to my profit question, which is you said no, you couldn't provide that. I did try to look it up while we're online. Would the presenters be willing to provide a breakdown of the last filed fiscal year? I suspect that's 2023, between what money went to the parent company and what went to, I suspect, Denendeh. So I can actually see how much the company is making, because you did say it was publicly available, although I'm having a difficult time finding it specifically. And I'd like to know what the partnership really actually financially means in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Over to Mr. Massie, I think.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess we take that as a bit of an undertaking to take that away and provide that information, because we're happy to provide that. Again, I don't know the dollar figure, but in terms of percentages and returns that utilities, so again, all utilities are to file for a return on equity, so that's their investment, including the Crown corporations across the north. They file to get a return, and again about recycling that capital. We're happy to provide that. Just on the comment of electrical rates increasing, and that's really part of us being here today, is that we see recent rate applications, increases of 25%, and then our increase we're before the board for Yellowknife for 5%. We do see the costs increasing, and we see with more challenges in front of utilities that there is a lot of investment needed in electrical infrastructure. So that is going to put cost pressures on the utilities, whoever that utility is, and that's across Canada. I would say in my time, so I've worked in the utility here in the north for 35 years, and I we talk to customers quite often, and we totally understand the affordability issue. So again, back to us being here today is really to highlight some of those challenges we see, and then some of the solutions that we think can be put in place to bring those costs down. Because those investments are still going to need to be put in place. We're still going to have to provide safe, reliable power. It's just how we go about doing it to make it as affordable as we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up question?
I will welcome any further written reply that they can provide. I would just normally say through the chair, so committee receives it in that manner. The only observation I'll make, Mr. Chairman, lastly, is I was actually there at the Robertson report process from the start to the changes of the current structure. I didn't support the current structure, but the Assembly was taking on a new policy position, and sometimes things move forward that you don't support, but, I hate to say it, it is what it is. That said, the suggestion of going back to, and even in some form, not necessarily exactly, to the old structure of localized or regional structure, financial structure, will significantly change the affordability of many of our smaller communities and regions. That will provide some respite in Yellowknife. I'm unsure what that would be. Obviously, as a Yellowknife MLA, I would say anything that helps our constituents are good, but I'm also a territorial MLA. And territorially, I would certainly stress that, I worry about the global impact on, it provides relief on one side, but it also provides pain on the other. And are we just finding a different way to subsidize? And lastly, on the subsidized side, if I remember correctly, the NWT's waived profit off the power utility for many years. I can't speak to it exactly at the second. I didn't pull up that information, but I know it's been many years that they waived that. And it went back into the territorial subsidy program to make smaller communities affordable. So ultimately, my question, Mr. Chairman, really comes down to is Naka Power saying today or recognizing today that the suggestion of unencumbering the way that the utility rates are designed today by taking off the administration from the largest centers, are they prepared to recognize or realize that these will increase the power rates in the regions and in the smallest of our communities? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Massie looks like he's prepared to take that on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, what we're saying is that with the current rate system, again, there's some unequal rates out there for similar customers in similar communities. And really, if we look at the NWT as a whole and look at both utilities, what costs go into electricity rates, look at what the best solution is for rate zones and rate charges to different customers, that would be the best place for it. We have suggestions, of course. We're not the only ones that would have suggestions. What we would like is to have that bigger meeting with the utilities and the government to see what can be done. And understanding there are challenges of moving costs around. But if all customers can at least have the same support from the government in their rates, that would be a win for customers and win for both utilities, I think.
Thank you very much. Do I have round 2 questions from other members?
Just one last comment. Not a question, Mr. Chairman, if no one jumps in.
Go ahead, Mr. Hawkins. I don't see other hands right now, so it's open to you.
Not a problem. Thank you. And I would just say, in the context of fullness of sharing, I've often thought and have thought moving forward in the sense of affordability that perhaps the territorial government should manage the administrative cost. That would provide micro, if not better than micro, respite in the larger regions, and then we can get back to more of a truer rate cost. I'm not suggesting the information suggested our presenters are completely wrong. I'm not in a position to say that, but I do think that there was a major shift years ago, and I was there at the time. So an undertaking I may bring up to committee for further discussions, that the core administration cost is a territorial issue. Isn't that the intent? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. That wasn't presented specifically as a question, but of course, if Naka would like to respond, they're welcome to. Mr. Massie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure I understood the full context of the comment for sure. It sounds like MLA Hawkins has some history that predates me, but if he has some further.
I can provide a comment, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Go ahead, Mr. Hawkins, if you want to clarify what you were sort of asking there, or if maybe you weren't asking. I'm not sure.
No, I wasn't asking, but what I was saying that it's maybe an undertaking I will bring to committee, and I wanted to ensure I commented with the presenters in the room so they heard. The administrative costs of the regions and smaller communities was dumped on the cost of Yellowknife residents. In other words, that artificially inflated the rates in Yellowknife to offset the rates in the communities. And it was a formula created by one of the former governments. Yes, the presenter's right, it did predate him. But that was an economic solution and a political decision to do that. It was at a time when the rate riders were falling off of Yellowknife, but they were maintained, so they could argue that no increases were coming into Yellowknife at the time, but the rate riders were scheduled to come off. So that's where they found their savings, or I'd say their wash at the time. It's something I'll raise with the committee at large, that perhaps maybe we should be examining the administrative costs of these burdens rather than being dumped on the Yellowknife network. And in essence, the Yellowknife consumer directly should be treated as a territorial cost through the government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Rogers, I have you up for second round questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I guess speaking from someone who lives in the region and has benefited in the past, of course, of subsidies, and this is kind of I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but are you saying that because Naka with his partner, ATCO, could be more efficient in doing this work? It's what you do, you are a utility company. And going to a two-rate system then, is it your assumption, or is it your, say assumption, I guess, but would you say that by going to the postage stamp and having the one-rate system, that it wouldn't adversely affect the regions, that would actually benefit all residents with the rates? Is it fair to say?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's rate design is terribly complicated. I know how exciting it is to talk about it, but I can't say for myself that it wouldn't adversely affect anyone. It would change costs for someone. So really what we're saying is if we have the decision makers in the room, the utilities, government, possibly the PUB, just to work on the total cost and how that rate design would look so it is fair and subsidized, I guess, the same across the territory, because that's the part that could be solutioned on how government subsidies get applied to electrical rates to assist everyone. In the end, it would have to be terribly complicated, but it'd have to be figured out between those in the room of how the costs are allocated. But the overall costs, if those efficiencies are put in place, will be less.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, you have a second?
Yeah, more of a comment, and again, I've said this, and I'll likely be saying it again in February. I think it's time we need to start thinking outside the box, given what's happening right now with power rates across the territory. I welcome any kind of innovation or any kind of conversation we can have, certainly with with our government officials, with public representatives, and certainly with industry, and how we can think outside the box and look at ways to make our energy supply much more efficient, and things that we hadn't looked at in the past, that maybe it's time to start looking at that. So certainly appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rogers. I'm not seeing any further questions from committee at this time in round two. I do have a few more. We might as well use your time while we've got it. Something I wanted to dig into a bit, since we have a little bit of time, is I'm curious. I mean, when when the news hits about these rate applications, often, with great envy, it's reported upon the rates that are enjoyed by people across the country in comparison to the Northwest Territories. And certainly it's pointed out that the Northwest Territories is the most expensive region in the country. I'm curious to hear Naka's, or I guess maybe a better way of putting it is ATCO, because I think it's ATCO that's actually operating in the Yukon. But if you can talk about our neighbors and how their systems are working, and perhaps what you see as the comparisons, and why is it that we are in the position of having more expensive power here in the territory in comparison to other areas that you operate. I'd be curious to hear if you have some insights for us on how things are operating over there and how things could be done differently here. Thanks. Pretty open-ended question, but Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's where I've worked for the 35 years of my utility experience is the Yukon, so I have a good understanding of it. What I would say that the two territories, they have quite a few similarities, just that they were devolved. The federal government's built the large hydros. It was devolved back in the mid-'80s to the territories, along with the generation and transmission that was moved from the federal government to the territorial governments. Very similar. Of course, we're very similar too, because ATCO is working over there with the Crown Corp over there to supply electricity. What I would say that what comes to mind to me, the big difference between the Yukon and NWT is the amount of isolated communities you have. There's 4 isolated communities in the Yukon. So isolated means they run on a diesel power plant. Old Crow is the most isolated one that we operate in, where fuel is flown in, so costs are high. In the NWT, you have 20 more isolated communities with those isolated costs. Diesel generation is expensive, not only monetarily, of course, but for the environment. But that cost is significant. And I would say it very much mirrors Nunavut, which has 25 isolated communities also. So that would be a big part of the cost difference, is the amount of isolation, how big the NWT is, how isolated so many of the communities are, where you could not possibly charge community-based rates. And that's why I moved away from that, I'm assuming, back in 2001, was extremely high costs for those communities, especially the ones that are fly-in only. To me, that would be what I would think is the big difference between the two territories. Just how the high cost is across 20 some odd communities that are isolated, that have to be borne throughout the territory.
Okay, thank you. And in follow-up to that, I mean, so that's a situation that, of course, Naka cannot change. What I'm curious to hear is, aside from the postage stamp rates that you've kind of proposed to committee today, I mean, do you have other ideas for, you've suggested that this simplification of the utility functions, or kind of, handing over utility functions to your company and leaving NTPC to stick with generation could potentially produce savings. Can you detail for committee like how you would see that happening, knowing that the problem is fixed? We've got a lot of isolated communities. That problem's not going away. So how do we get at this problem, and how do you actually envision bringing rates down? Because you've suggested that you can. I'm curious to hear what your ideas are for how that could be achieved, and how Naka could help the territory achieve that goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think really part of that is the fact that there's duplication right now. Like if we're both operating distribution, we both have distribution employees, PLT linemen that climb power poles. We both have a billing system. We both have a warehousing that supplies poles and wires. We both have generation, so we both deal with power plants. So there's some duplication in that, and that's really the part that would be solved, I guess, by the looking at the utility functions. If a utility just only concentrates on, you pick it, if there's only one company that runs a billing system, then there's one billing system. There's one place for customers to call, and there's one thing to do there. So you're just able to consolidate and be a little more efficient and remove that duplication. When you have a group of employees that just work on generation, you really are able to have them focus just on that, on the generation that is, whether it's hydro or thermal, that just concentrates them and has them look at one function, as opposed to having a company that has all sorts of different functions in it. Really, that's the part where we think that there are efficiencies to be gained. So if you're able to just focus on that, you remove, for example, just have one billing system in NWT. That's a big cost savings right there, rather than the two utilities that have our two separate billing systems, and customers get the same bills. That's just one example, but I'm sure if we were to go down this path, there would be a bit of a review of what could be looked at for those efficiencies.
Thank you. And just opening up to committee, just if anyone has follow-up questions, I will kind of cede to a committee member, but not seeing any. I have one more. Just the follow-up that came to mind for me there in that answer is, of course, that I'm sure if asked, NTPC would probably say the same thing. It's duplication. That's the problem. You need to just turn everything over to us, and we'll solve all the issues. So I guess the necessary question to put back on you then is, why is it that Naka is better positioned to create a distribution in such a way that saves customers money? Like, how do we go beyond simply taking your word for it, and how can you show us that would be a better way of doing things?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say really the whole point in looking at functions of utilities is the efficiency of it, and that's why most jurisdictions look at that, having utilities run their separate functions. What I would say on behalf of Naka is the fact that we've been here for the 70 years, as Mr. Beaulieu pointed out. We're quite familiar with the communities we operate in. We've been a northern utility for a very long time. It's not an easy role. So for anybody to walk in and pick that up is going to be definitely difficult. So our experience being in the north, for one, and the fact that we have the benefit of being tied to ATCO, and with that comes the efficiency of having the supply chains. We're able to reach out and access engineers and field technicians. The emergency situation of the wildfire on the other side of the lake in Hay River, we had multiple crews from ATCO that were able to roll into Hay River and Enterprise and rebuild it. It's very beneficial to be able to lean on our affiliate when needed. Looking at if it was, as you mentioned, NTPC could do it all, that's really again, coming from a multi-generational northerner, I understand the role of government in the north. I know how big it is. I really think there is a balance to be found between how big government is and how private sector can assist government. And as I look at the debt cap ceiling and the population and industry low growth in the Yukon or in the NWT, it really could be of assistance with that from us. That's what I see.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for committee's indulgence. I have Mr. Hawkins for one final comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I just want to reaffirm, I'm not against ATCO, as a matter, and I just want to reaffirm I recognize how great of a company and probably a corporate citizen they represent, and that filters down to Naka. I think really ultimately our problem comes down to accessibility. So in other words, the fact that we don't have the options the Yukon has, whereas in things are easier to connect and larger populations are in the manner that they are. And lastly, the population growth is, I think, ultimately the secret to our power cost solution. We need more customers. We need more people to use power in different ways. Yeah. So anyway, that's just my final comment. And I think that I welcome their suggestions, and I think committee will have some good discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give committee one last chance. If anyone has last questions that they're just burning to get off the table before Naka leaves for the day. Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Okay, so this is an Indigenous-owned. So I'm just wondering if you guys, I know you mentioned the other Indigenous communities that are isolated, that there's like 26 isolated communities, and I have 2, that is isolated, was 3. If you approach other communities, maybe to join or to provide services to. So I just want to know if you approach any of these communities, that maybe they would like to switch over. I'm not too sure, but I just wanted to ask that.
Thank you. Mr. Massie, looks like wants to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the short answer is no, we have not approached any communities to switch or move over. We haven't, and we've had conversations over time at events like Darrell's Economic Forum, where communities ask us good questions, but we have not had any conversations, no.
Thank you. Ms. Whalen Armstrong, do you have a follow-up on that one?
That was it, but I just wanted to ask, I'll ask another question then. Okay, there's a transmission line going from, Towson to Fort Providence, and there's from Wati to Snare Hydro. So did you guys talk to the Indigenous government to see if, you know, if you can have some input or maybe, you know, to provide services or partner? Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Mr. Massie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have not had discussions on the Wati project at all. For the Fort Providence transmission line, we have been in conversation with NWT for some time. Just as that project, of course, we are the franchise provider for Fort Providence and Dory Point and Kikiza and Enterprise, so the entire route of the line. We've been involved in those conversations for some time, just with the GNWT though. And really that has been, we've had some conversations with Fort Providence, but our role on the project is not clear, so until we have that clarity, that we really don't have a conversation just yet.
Thank you. Yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of our time with Naka. So I just wanted to, before we go, thank you, Mr. Beaulieu, and your staff for the presentation and taking the time to answer committee's questions. And now would be the time if you have any closing statements or comments that you'd like to make for committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, the members of the committee, for the questions and the opportunity to come and do a presentation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's, and Jay's mentioned, it's quite complex on rate and rate designs. And so I think the solutions is for whether it's, you know, the utilities to sit down, the government and the PUB and develop a rate design that's going to look at the affordability of electricity to our constituents, whether, you know, they're in the various regions and the communities. And so to do that, I think you have to pause the rate design system or phase 2 and start looking at saying, okay, what can we do to ensure the efficiencies, whether it's in operations or functions, whether it's the Crown Corporation or else in the private sector, that plays a role in generating electricity to the north. So finding those efficiencies is, something that we have been enunciating for quite a while, and I think it's really important that we action and really sit down and look at affordable rates and affordable processes to ensure that those rates are sustainable for the companies that do deliver it, and of course the people in Northwest Territories. So, the underlying objective is equality for everybody, right throughout. And some of the questions in terms of, how we're set up, Naka is a 50-50 financial partnership. So everything's 50-50. So, and of course, everything that we bring to the north is reinvested in the north. So that's, just wanted to leave that with you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Jay had a closing comment.
Said it all.
Okay, well, thanks again on behalf of committee for coming and presenting to us. And I just wanted to follow up to make sure Naka did commit to get some information back to us in response to Mr. Hawkins' question, so I see Mr. Massie nodding there. If you want to send that to me or committee staff, that'll get to committee. And again, on behalf of committee, thanks for presenting. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, who's online and on the TV. And that concludes the public portion of our meeting. Committee members, let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at 10 after 3 just to debrief. But for everyone else, thanks for tuning in, and this concludes our broadcast. Thank you.